So the first one we're going to look at here is the Pro Photography with the camera. And it's kind of a cheesy little camera, but it's pretty easy to build. And then we could always modify it and make it look a little bit better afterwards. So what I'm going to do is zoom in on this section, Command plus. If I were to pull it apart just so you can see how it's built, you'll see it's just, first of all, let's ungroup it. That's Shift Command G to ungroup. I've already grouped all these pieces together, but you'll see this is just a series of little tiny shapes, really rectangles. And there's another rectangle, and this is just a circle inside. So I'm going to undo, pull it all back together again so that we can use it as a reference. And now we're going to build this off to the side, and I'm going to take you through the steps of how to do that. First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to take my toolbar and I'm just going to float it out onto my page because I find it a little bit easier to have it nice and close to my working space. The other thing I'm going to do is just click here on the double arrows, and what that does is it condenses my toolbar into one skinny little palette. Again, it's just easier to find your tools instead of the double toolbar. So I'm going to come down here to the rectangle tool. So you'll see that right here. If you click and hold it down, you see there's other tools nested behind it, but we want the rectangle tool. And I'm just coming out onto my page and I'm going to press and drag and create a rectangle. Now, if it's not the right size, I can come back to my selection tool, which is the black arrow tool at the top, or click on the V key on your keyboard. And you can always come back and adjust it a little bit so it looks a little bit more the way you'd like it to look. So I'm just going to deselect by clicking away from it. I'm also going to zoom in again a little bit more so that we can see this clearly. So again, I'm using my Command plus to zoom in. So I've got my rectangle, it's a bit wide, so I'm just going to shorten that up a little bit. I am going to use my guidelines here too, the grid in the background, just to help me kind of build this and kind of keep on track with it. So the next thing I'm going to do is the bar on the top. So again, back to my rectangle tool, I'm going to come up here again using my background grid and click and drag out my rectangle. And that's okay for now. Again, I could adjust that if I needed to. If you want to change the fill on this, just select it with the selection tool, come up into your control panel. You've got a fill button and you've got a stroke button. So fill for filling with color, stroke for outlining in color. So if I just click and display my drop down color palette, I could choose a new color. So let's say I want that to be a lighter shade of gray, and maybe this one as well. Select that, come back up into this area and just choose a lighter shade of gray. So then to deselect, just click somewhere on your page where you don't have any objects. And now what I need to do is the bottom piece of the camera. So since I've already built this rectangle, I'm not going to build it again. I'm going to use what I have already and save some time. So I'm holding down the Option key on my keyboard. I'm in my selection tool, and now I can just pull out a second one and just place it where I need it to go. So that's a bit far away, so I am going to move these slightly closer so that I have less space in these areas. You can use your arrow keys to nudge these up and down and to the left and right as well. Now, next thing I'm going to do are my buttons, the little center bit here of my camera. So again, back to the rectangle tool. I'm going to actually draw it away from my shape like so and just move it into position like so. I want that to overlap a little bit because when you deselect, you'll see you can't really see that it's a separate shape. And again, another one, a little button here. So just click and drag out my little button, and once again, I'm going to hold down my Option key. I'm going to drag one over to the other side here, like so, and just kind of nudge this guy in the middle so that he's centered. And that looks pretty good for now. So basically my camera is almost built. I just need to now add a circle. in the center. So I'm coming back to my shape tools. I'm going to go to the ellipse tool this time, which builds ovals, like so. I'm going to delete that. I'm going to hold down my Shift key to create a perfect circle, and in fact, if I hold down the Option key, it will draw that circle out from the center, which is probably a little bit better to work with. So now I'm going to fill this with white, so back up to my fill button, fill with white, and now with my selection tool, I'm just going to move this and get it lined up where I want it to be. I just want to make sure that these are both centered, so I'm going to select both the camera body and the lens, so the rectangle and the circle. I'm coming up into my alignment tools here at the top, and I am going to center them horizontally and also center them vertically. So they are now centered to each other. So if I needed to, I could come back and adjust that circle. So again, I am going to hold down the Shift and the Option key. Just come to one of the corner handles. Let's make that a little bit smaller. Looks good enough for now. It's obviously a little bit misshapen, so I could actually go in and adjust this further. So again, holding down the Shift and the Option key, make the lens a little smaller. Let's bump that up to the top. I'm taking the bottom handle and actually shortening up the camera body because I feel like it's too deep. And now taking this guy and I'm just nudging it up with my nudge tools or my arrow tools. And I think that's a little bit better. So to finish this off, I would just select the entire thing and I would go up to Object and I would just group it together. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do now is go and add in our text. So I'm going to pull my toolbar nice and close to my working space, and I'm going to go to my T tool, which is my type tool. Click on that, and I'm just going to build my text below my camera body, and then once I'm happy with it, I'll move it into position after that. So I'm just going to click once on my page. I get some lorem ipsum text that pops up by default. Not a problem. Once we start typing, that will disappear. So I've got my caps lock on. I'm going to type in PRO and then hit return. Type in photography. Let's double check that, make sure I spelled it right. Looks good. And it just chooses the last typeface that I used in Illustrator. So I'm going to select my text, select all of it. I'm coming up into my character palette here in the control panel at the top. Now I can just use my options right here. So there's my font, there's the style, there's the size and the alignment. But in this case, I'm going to use my character palette. So I'm just going to click on the character palette. I get many of the same options, but a whole lot more that pop up. So I'm coming down to my font, and I'm pretty sure I used DIN or DIN, condensed bold, for the original. So I'm going to choose that. And I am going to bump up the size of the font a little bit as well. So just using the up arrow, make that a teeny bit bigger. And in fact, I'll make Pro even bigger than that. So select just the Pro area and then back to my character palette, and then let's bump that up. So if I click away from this, just deselect it. I'm going to take another look at it here, and let's pull this up next to our camera. And yeah, I think I want the Pro to be a little bit bigger. I think the photography could go down a point or two, but then I want to add in the space between each of those characters, which we call tracking. So once again, select Pro and bump up the size. This time I'll just use my control panel here. And that's probably good. And then photography, select that. Maybe bring that down just a couple of points. I don't want it to be too big and too clunky. And then the next thing I'm going to do is go back into my character palette. And this time I'm going to come down to this fourth option here. So on the second level to the right, this is called our tracking. And if I just click on this up arrow, you'll see that it very slowly and very gently adds in space between each of the characters and kind of pushes those apart. So I'm going to keep going until that Y lines up with the edge of the camera. And by the way, adding in tracking to capped letters is pretty popular these days, so you'll see it quite a bit. It has a very elegant look to it. It works best with caps and a little less so with upper lower. So now if I just click away from this and deselect, I think that's looking pretty close, at least close enough. I think you get the idea. Okay, so one last thing I have to do here. Right now, my text is tied to the font that I used, meaning if I sent this file out to, say, a newspaper or to a printer where they were going to maybe print some stuff for me, if I didn't send along that font, the DIN condensed, they would be missing the font and they would end up with some pretty wacky default in place that I don't want. So there's one last thing that I have to do with this text. Just grab just my text and just note that I'm using my black arrow tool, which is the selection tool. Select that text block like so, and I am going to take it from a font, or being font dependent, into vector artwork. So I do that by coming up to type, coming down to create outlines, and when I choose that, it turns my text into, well, essentially into artwork. So if I deselect this and come back with my direct selection tool, which is the little white arrow that sits second tool down, I can actually come in and spot the anchor points now, because this is artwork. And at any time now, I could come in and modify what that artwork or that text looks like. So I'm just going to undo because I don't like that, Command Z, and I'm just going to leave things as they are. One more time, group it all together so it's one big object. And now this is a complete logo. I've got my graphic built with the shapes. I've got my text in a way, set in a way that I'm happy with the look of it, and I've made sure that there aren't any spelling errors. And then I've converted that into outlines. So once again, what I did was select that text, come up to type, and I came down to create outlines. So this is now a finished logo. Here is the camera that has the rounded edges and the big fat lens that has the triple outline on it. It actually looks like it's a bunch of shapes that are stacked on top of each other, but it's not. It's actually done using the appearance panel. So again, just zooming in on this, let's just move our page over, and I'm going to very quickly show you how this was built. So before we get started, I'm just going to click on it. I am going to ungroup it, and I want to show you guys that this is really just a very few simple shapes that are stacked. So very similar to what we did already in creating the camera body above and the little buttons, but there's a couple of main differences here. One being the shape of this rectangle, so it's been modified, and then also the lens. How do we create that? So I am going to move these off to the side, and I'm just going to come right into what we have built here, and I'm going to show you how to add in these other pieces and how they were created. So again, this is just a rectangle filled with black. In this case, I just have another rectangle or a line, in this case, that's sitting over top of it, looking like it's breaking through. And then little rounded rectangles sitting above, and those make our little buttons. And so now what we want to do is add in the flash section. So coming to my shape tools, so click, hold it down. Rectangle is usually the one on top. We're going down to the rounded rectangle this time. So I am going to select that, and I'm going to build the flash just above and then move it into position. So I'm going to drag and draw out my flash section. So that looks probably about a good place to start. And let's turn off our stroke. So up into the control panel, turn off the stroke. And with the fill, we need it to be a darker color. So I think that's black. And now I've got a little rounded rectangle. Let's just see how that fits. And I think that's going to be okay. But what I want to do next is actually distort the bottom of the rectangle. So as you can see in the sample, it's wider. It's kind of like a pyramid. So what I'm going to do is grab my anchor points, which are situated at the bottom of this rectangle. And you can see there's 2 on either side. And we're going to pull them out. So I'm going to deselect. I'm going to come back and just drag over those 2 anchor points that I know are there. And I'm going to use my arrow keys. So I'm just going to count out the number of steps just to keep this a mirrored image, to keep it just symmetrical. So I'm going to count out with my arrow key. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think we'll do it. Then come to the other side, deselect, come to the other side, grab these 2 anchors that I know are there, and using my right arrow key, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that keeps it symmetrical. So looks pretty good. It'll do. Come back up to my black arrow, my regular selection tool, and now just move this into position. And I'm also keeping an eye on these little pink guidelines that are popping up because they help me to center things. They help me to see things a little bit better. You'll see with this particular camera, the buttons are different sizes. So things are a little bit different on this one. Just deselect. And I think that looks pretty good. I think it's centered. Looks good to me. So the next thing I want to do at this point is now recreate this circle. And it's one circle, even though it looks like it could be potentially 4, really 1, 2, 3, 4. It's one circle with a stroke on it, a very large stroke, and then another stroke that's inset using the appearance panel. So move this over, and I'm going to come to my ellipse tool, and I'm going to use the shift key to make the perfect circle, but the option key to draw from the center out, because it just makes things a little bit easier. So let's make it about so big, and I can always adjust it afterwards. Now this has got a big, huge stroke on it. So I want to point out that the circle I just drew has a white fill. So up here in the fill section, white is what it's filled with. And then the stroke is a gray stroke right there. But the stroke itself is huge. So I'm actually going to round it up to about 28 point. And in fact, I'm going to make this smaller. So coming back to my circle, I'm going to hold down the shift key. And let's just make this guy smaller. He's a bit too big already. Okay, so we've got a white fill, we've got a gray stroke. So how do we get this additional white stroke in the middle that's perfectly centered? I'm going to come over to my palettes on the side, and in fact I'm just going to float my mouse over the left hand side, and I'm going to drag out my palette list so that I can actually see what these different icons are, what these palettes are. It's much easier than trying to figure out the icons. So if you just pull them out, you can easily find what you're looking for. Now I'm looking for appearance, so open up my appearance panel, pull this out, float it right on my screen. Let's take a look at it. Right now it's telling me that I have a white fill on this shape and I have a 28 point gray stroke on it. So what I'm going to do is add an additional stroke, and I do this by coming down to this Add New Stroke button. So click on that. It now adds another stroke that is identical to the original stroke. So therefore, I don't see anything change on the shape whatsoever. What I have to do now is go in and adjust it. So I'm going to change right off the bat the color of that stroke to white. And it looks like it's obliterated the gray stroke, but it's really just the gray stroke is hiding behind it. So now as I pull down the stroke weight, you'll see that it's perfectly centered over top of the other stroke. So get that to a point that I'm happy with. Maybe we'll try 6. And this is fairly similar. So again, using my selection tool, let's just put these 2 guys side by side. They look pretty close. Looks good to me. Now I can come into my artwork and get it positioned. It's still maybe a little bit too big, so I'm gonna make it a bit smaller. So again, Shift and Option at the same time, and just make that a teeny bit smaller, and maybe go a little bit further with that. Okay, that's pretty good. And on the original, it hung down a little bit lower than the bottom of the camera body. So just using my arrow keys, I'm just kind of nudging it down a little bit, like so. And then deselect. And that's pretty close. So again, last step, select everything together, group it, and add in my text. And don't forget, with your text, you're always creating outlines and turning that text or that font into vector, and that's how you finish things off. So looks good. Okay guys, the next thing we're going to do here now is take a look at how the nature photography logo is built. And it's really pretty simple. Illustrator has updated some of their tools, their drawing tools, in such a way that it makes it so much easier for us to create smooth little graphics, whereas before we'd have to really kind of fuss with them. Now it's a whole lot easier, thank goodness. So I'm going to zoom in and just get myself positioned here and just very quickly show you how this is built. So we have this portion, which is the leaf, and I'm just going to bump that up a little bit, and you'll see it's a separate piece from the text, which is sitting below. And basically all I've done is just attach the two of them so that it looks like it's one kind of piece. So very quickly, we're going to start by adding in our text. So I'm going to grab this and maybe just move it down out of the way a little bit. I'm going to come to my text tool. I'm just going to click here on my page and then type in my wording. So nature photography, like so. And actually I kind of like that. That's that same DIN that we used before, and I like the look of that, but I think that for the sake of matching this, we'll go ahead and modify this. So selecting my text, coming up to character, I am for this going to turn off the tracking and just make that 0. So I'm just actually keying in 0 and hitting the return key, and that brings it back to just a normal tracking. And for the font, I believe this font is LinoScript, and you can see it previewing beneath my menu, which is actually really helpful. And now I'm going to bump up the size. So I'm just matching this, kind of eyeballing it right now. So I think that looks probably pretty good. So back to my selection tool, let's move this down, and we'll sit it right there. I will just leave the color for now. We don't have to do any kind of colorizing at this point, because we'll come back and modify that later. So now I'm going to bring over my toolbar. Let's just place it close to what we're creating. For any of you that know Illustrator, you've probably learned to use the pen tool, which is actually the very best tool to use to do any kind of drawing or tracing. When it comes to Illustrator, you're going to get the best control using this tool. However, it's a slightly complex tool to learn, so there is definitely a learning curve with that. So we're going to choose some tools that are a little bit easier for us as beginners. So I'm just going to jump down to my pencil tool, and it actually hides behind the shaper tool. So this is probably what you're going to see in your toolbar. So you want to click, hold it down, and go to the pencil tool. Now the pencil tool will allow us to just draw things quite randomly. Let me just undo that. And what I want to do here is actually double click on the pencil tool to bring up the dialog box. Let's make sure that your fidelity is set to smooth. And what that's going to do is smooth out your drawing as you draw it, and we get a much better looking path or line when we're done. So make sure you bump that up to smooth, and that's going to make life a whole lot easier for you. So we'll click OK. And then I'm going to come up into my control panel. I want to turn off my fill because that's only going to get in the way if I leave it. So I'm going to make it none. And then for the stroke, well, I could go in and pick the green for now. I may choose a different color later, but I'll choose green for now. And I know that this is a thicker stroke than just 1 point, so I'm actually going to bump that up a little bit. I think probably around 3 points is probably good. And at this point, you're probably going to have to practice a little bit and maybe draw some shapes, delete them, try again until you kind of get the hang of it. One thing that I find is if you're working on a MacBook or a laptop, you really should have a mouse for this kind of thing because it's quite difficult to draw with a trackpad. Even better than a mouse is using a pen and some kind of tablet to draw with. You're going to get better results. I'm used to drawing with a mouse, but truthfully, it's like drawing with a bar of soap. So you have to kind of get used to it. Okay, so I'm going to start here, and I am just going to roughly draw this, and I'm not going to let go. I'm going to press and drag. I'm not going to let go until I've completed my shape. And I'm not going to worry too much about what it looks like because I can always come back to this and then modify it afterwards. So I'm just going to do this just quickly, roughly, and then I can adjust it afterwards. So there we go. You see my hand was a little bit rough as I was drawing it, but fortunately Illustrator smooths that out with the smooth fidelity. Okay, so it's a pretty wonky looking leaf, you can see that. But that's not a problem because what I'm going to do is come back to my direct selection tool. So that's the second tool down, it's the white filled arrow. That allows me to modify anchor points, and you can see there are individual anchor points here. As I run my mouse along, you see they pop up, and at the moment all of those anchor points, just by default, they are selected, and I know they're selected because they are filled with blue. So I'm going to take a look to see where these anchor points are, and then I will deselect by clicking away from it. And then I can come back in and modify them. So I know that there's one at the top here. I want to bring this up higher. So I'm actually going to pull this up a little bit. Maybe we'll come up to about there. Now it's really wonky. So what I have to do is come to this anchor point here and pull that little guy up as well. And I'm not going to worry too much about the shape just yet. It's a bit harsh, right? It doesn't have really a very nice curve at the moment. But to adjust the curve, I am not only going to pull on the anchor points and reposition them. What I want to point out is with these anchor points, there are handles that grow out of these anchor points. So you'll see there's a handle there. If I click on this guy, it's got a handle on either side of the anchor point. So we want to grab those handles. There's one right there. And we want to reposition them. So as I pull out the anchor point, you'll see there's a handle, there's a handle, and by modifying these handles, I can reshape my artwork and get it looking the way I want it to look. So let's move this little anchor over as well, and let's grab one of the handles. You can extend it, make it a little bit longer, or see how I'm just literally moving those handlebars and it's changing the shape. Kind of get it smoothed out until I'm happy with the shape that I've got. Now I would probably spend a fair bit of time making this perfect. I won't make you guys sit through this because that would just put you to sleep. So I think at this point, I'm just going to get it as close as I can, just quickly. and then call it a day. So it's not perfect. I would continue to work on this a little bit further, but overall, I think I'm pretty happy with it. So I think I might make it a tad smaller. So using my regular selection tool, the black filled arrow, select it, hold down the shift key to constrain proportions, and just take one of the corner handles and make it a little smaller. And that looks pretty good. Now I'm going to grab it again with the selection tool. I am going to move it into position, like so. Maybe use my arrow keys to just nudge it a teeny bit. And let's zoom in as well so we can see this clearly. So move it into position. And right now it is sitting over top of my artwork, or my text, in other words. So I want to move this to the back. So with this selected, the leaf selected, go up to Object, go to Arrange, send all the way to the back, send to back. And that sends it behind my text. Now with my text, let's select that. Let's go in and match the color fill. So that's that green. I guess I could try a different color if I want it to be a different color. It's entirely up to you. Maybe we'll leave it as a charcoal gray. And then let's move this so that it is just kind of overlapping, like so. It's actually better if we keep it the same color, because I would be able to then modify it. You see a little bit of green poking out behind that, but that's okay. We're going to fix that. So now that I'm happy with my text, let's reposition here. Remember, the last step is always to turn it into vector art. So with my selection tool, select the entire text frame, come up to the type menu, go down to create outlines, and I've now just changed it into artwork. So in fact, one of the good things about changing this into artwork is now I can adjust the top of the stem on the T so that I can kind of hide that kind of little bit of green that's poking up there. So zoom in nice and close for this and reposition. Like so. And with my direct selection tool, I see I've got an anchor point there, I've got a couple here. These are what I'm going to modify. So I'm going to deselect, come back into this anchor point here. I am going to pull it up like so. It's right about there. It's pretty close. Okay, so I think I'm happy with that for a quick logo. So select the whole unit, just marquee over it, and group it. Command G. Okay, so next logo that we're going to create is the studio logo, the one with the little crops on it. So I'm going to zoom in, Command plus, get nice and close here. And basically, this is built with a rectangle that has a thicker stroke on it. I've removed portions of the rectangle, and I'm going to show you how to do that in a fast and easy way. And then I've inserted the text into the center. So very quickly, running over to my toolbar, to the rectangle tool, I'm going to draw out my rectangle. So just roughly, I'm going to use my guidelines to kind of help me align this a little bit. Like so. And in fact, I'm going to come up to view. I'm going to come down to my guides here and snap to grid is what I want. And that will just help snap the edges. So one thing I want to do is take away the fill. So get rid of the fill, remove that. And now I'm going to come and choose a stroke. So I think for the sake of being able to see this clearly, I'm going to choose a slightly darker gray stroke. And then I'm going to bump up the weight of that quite a bit. So I'm thinking maybe to this point. Now another thing I'm going to do is come over into my stroke palette here. I'm going to pull the stroke palette out and float it. I'm going to go to the little hamburger menu on the side and show options. And I am going to bump this stroke into the inner part of my path. So I click on this option here. It pushes the entire stroke or the gray area inside the path. You see the path is on the outside. Just a little bit easier to work with. So I'm going to move my stroke palette out of the way, and in fact I'm going to lighten up this stroke a touch further. So maybe to about that. I think you can still see that quite well. So normally what many new illustrators would do is find their eraser tool in their toolbar, and they would go about trying to erase the portion that they don't need. But what you'll see here is that when you're erasing and you've got a stroke, the stroke will continue to run around the area that you have erased. So this isn't going to work for us. So I'm going to undo, Command Z. So don't bother trying that. What we're going to do instead is create some little anchor points in here, and anchor points kind of act as joints. And then what we'll be able to do is delete those anchor points, and that will actually change our shape. So if I go to my direct selection tool and just clicking on my shape, you see that at the moment there are really only 4 anchor points that are a part of this particular shape. So I need to go and add some extra anchors in here so that I can then manipulate it a little bit further. So you'll want to go down to the pen tool. So that is the little calligraphy nib that you see in your toolbar. Press and hold it down and go to the option to add anchor points. So add anchor point tool. And then I'm going to use my guidelines here. I'm going to take a peek at this, and I'm going to say right about there on that guideline. I am going to go and just click onto my path and add in some anchor points. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 squares. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 squares on this side. I want to make sure that I keep this symmetrical. Okay, and then the same thing on the side. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, click, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, click, and then do the same on the opposite side. So I'm really adding in a number of different anchor points here that I can then manipulate, and you can see those. So next thing I'm going to do is go down to my editing tool. So I'm going to click and hold down the eraser tool. I'm going to grab the scissors tool. I'm just going to click on this guy and then click on this guy here. So I'm literally going around and just clicking on all of the new anchor points that I've selected. And what's happening is it's cutting apart my shape wherever I've got an anchor point. So now I can go in and select the portion that I don't want and delete. So what that's done is cut up the path. Now with my text, select my text tool, click on my page, add in the text I am looking for. Oh, wow, that looks awful. So we're going to change that. Select my text, and I think this looks somewhat like Futura. I don't quite remember what was used here, but we'll pick Futura and bump down the size a little bit. And we'll leave it as medium, and then select it, position it, and I want that maybe to pop out just a little tiny bit. So I'm going to make it a touch bigger. And I'm going to go and turn off off my snap to grid so that I can get a bit more detailed with where this sits. And then I could go and fill this with a different colored gray if I prefer to lighten it up. And then of course the last step is to select that text block, come up to type, and create outlines. Grab the whole thing, object group, done. So our next logo is going to be this Instagram style logo, and based on everything that we've looked at so far, this is actually very easy to create. So I'm going to pull out my toolbar and float it on my screen. I'm also going to click on the double arrows to place it into single file. And I'm going to build the logo right next to my original right here. So I'm actually going to take this text, which is really just reminder text. I'm going to move that out of the way. So the first thing that I want to point out is that this base shape is a rounded rectangle. So not the regular rectangle, but if I click and hold this down, you'll see I've got the rounded rectangle option here. So I select this, and I'm going to hold down my shift key so that I create a perfect square. So holding down the shift key and just click and drag out my shape. And I'll make this about that big. Now this automatically has a black fill, so I'm going to come back to my selection tool, just make sure it's selected, come up into my control panel, and I'm actually going to fill this with white. So I choose white. Next I'm going to move over to the stroke option. I'm going to choose the black stroke, and here under stroke weight I am going to just bump this up to about 8 point. So that looks good to me. Now the next thing I'm going to do is go in and add my lines, so the horizontal lines. So for this I can just use my line tool, so to the line segment tool, and I am just going to click and drag across, but I am going to hold down the shift key because what that's going to do is constrain it to a perfectly straight line. So draw that out. It keeps the same attributes as I originally set, which is a black stroke, 8 point. And then I could go ahead and draw another one below it, or I can just use my selection tool, make sure the object is selected, hold down my option key, and just drag out a duplicate. And that's the beauty of that. You don't have to keep recreating the wheel. You can just duplicate shapes that you've already created. So I'm just moving these into position, getting them lined up so that they look like they're equidistant apart. I think that that looks okay for now. I might actually select both of these and just bump them down a couple of points. I'm just using my arrow tools. Now the next part would be to create the circle section. So for this, back to my ellipse tool, which is hiding behind the rectangle tool, so a shape. And in this case, I'm drawing a perfect circle, so I'm going to hold down shift, but I want to draw it from the center out, the center of my object. So shift and option, I hold down and just drag out my shape. And I'm not going to worry too much about it being perfect because I can always come back and resize it when I'm done. So again, I'm going to come up, I'm going to fill this with white, and that looks okay to me. And so at this point, I'm actually going to make this a really thick stroke. So if you look at the original, it looks like there's two charcoal lines or outlines here. It's actually one thick one with a white stroke placed over top. So let's just bump that up nice and thick. And again, I can adjust that later. So now I've got one big thick stroke. So the key to having this lined up is to use our appearance panel. So just off to the right hand side, I'm just pulling out my palettes and I'm going to go to my appearance palette. And I'm just going to float that on my desktop. I can see that I have a 25 point black stroke, or maybe charcoal stroke, it's not quite black. and I've got a white fill. So what I'm going to do is come down to the lower left and I'm going to add a new stroke. So I click on this button, it duplicates the original stroke. So first thing I'm going to do is change the color of the stroke, and then here under stroke weight, just bring that down quite a bit. And what you'll see is it's centered over top of the original stroke. So it actually sits over top. So if I deselect now, you'll see that that sits right in the center. So for the most part, I've got all of the pieces in place. The only thing I want to add now is the heart. And there's a couple of things you can do for this. You could use your pen tool to draw a heart and spend a little bit of time getting that right and then laying it into the center of the lens. Or I'll show you a little trick. There's actually a font that we could use that has little dingbats and little icons that make it really easy to include these in our logo design. So if I come up to type at the top here and come down to glyphs, I get a palette that pops up, gives me all of the different characters that can be found in every single font that we have available to us. Right now, by default, this is set to Myriad Pro. So I'm going to click and hold this down, and I'm going to scroll all the way down to Zapf Dingbats. So this right here, bit of a weird spelling, but that's what I'm looking for. And I can see all of the different icons that are available to me under this particular font. So coming back now to my text tool or type tool, I am just going to click, I'm going to do this off to the side. So I'm just going to click once on my page, and you see I get a bunch of little gibberish icons that pop up automatically. So I'm not going to worry about those. I'm just going to come right back into my glyph palette. I've spotted the heart that I want to use, and all I have to do now is just double click. And now what you'll see here is this is turned into a heart. So I'm done with my glyph palette. I can close that up, come back, select the heart, and just up in my control panel, just bump up the size roughly to where I want it to be. Go to my selection tool, and then click and drag this into position, like so. And overall, looks pretty good. Maybe we'll give this a different fill. So maybe we will make it gray like the original, or maybe red, whatever color you like. It's entirely up to you, whatever works for you. Maybe we'll leave it as this pink for now. The last step is to take this, because it's a font, I have to go up to the type menu and choose Create Outlines. So I've now essentially turned it into artwork. It is no longer font dependent. So now, just with my selection tool, grab the whole thing, select it all, and group it together, object group, and we're done. I can now move it around on my screen or resize it, holding down the Shift key, and the whole thing now works together as one complete logo. The next two logos that I'm going to demonstrate are actually very, very simple, and they are very much based on text. So we might call these watermark style logos. It doesn't really matter what you call them. They're very easy to make. So we're going to start here by reproducing this little guy right here. And quite simply, it's really just a circle with some stylized text in it. So I'll start with going to my ellipse tool, and I'm going to hold down my Shift key so that I get a nice perfect circle. So draw that out, come up to my fill button, and I'm going to go with a dark charcoal gray. I won't make this actually black, but a nice dark charcoal gray. You really could choose any color that you wanted to for this. So there, I've got the base of my logo. The next thing, create my little icon. So again, this is text. So I'm going to my type tool, and I'm going to click and do this away from my artwork. I'll move it into position when I'm done. So I'm just going to click here on my page. I've got some weird gibberish text that pops up, and this is actually a J, so I'm going to type in J. And of course, this could be anything. Select my text, come up to character, and here I will choose the font that I'm looking for. So I happen to know that the original font that I used is Recorda. So I'm going to go choose Recorda, and I'm going to adjust the size. So I want it to be a little bit bigger, maybe up to 100. And now with my selection tool, let's grab this guy. Let's change the fill color. So it could be any colored fill. It could be gray, it could be a different color, blue, pretty much anything. So we'll keep it as blue for now. I'll come back and change this in a minute. So now what I'm going to do is just drag it into position and get it lined up, adjust the size, and anything else that kind of suits my logo. I'm coming into the corner where the corner handle is. I'm just drifting my mouse off to the side. You see a bit of a curly arrow there. So I now can rotate this because I want it to look like it's kind of very loosely drawn on here. Just get that into position. Take a look at it. Let's zoom in, Command plus. And I'm liking it so far, but I have to admit, I am not liking the color. So we're going to try or audition some other colors here to see what works. Green and charcoal, kind of like that. I think that that's quite nice. But I could always go super plain and just pick another shade of gray here. Maybe a little bit lighter. And I think I'm kind of liking that. So I can nudge that over a teeny bit just using my arrow keys, get it to where I want it, and looks good to me. So final step, taking that text frame, selecting it with my selection tool, come up to type, and then down to create outlines. And now I've turned it into artwork, so I could always go in and modify this a little bit further. But if I'm happy with it, just select them both together and then group, object, group, or Command G. That will work as well. The next one here is based solely on text, and again, this is fairly easy to do, but you have to pick some interesting typefaces to really make this work. So I've used the font Metropolis for the background MI, and then Dido or Didot for Metropolis imagery text that runs over top of it. So I'm just going to create this down below, and again, it's all text-based. So I'm going to have to use my text tool almost exclusively for this. So with the type tool, click, and now type in MI. I'm going to select my text, come up into my character palette, and now go and find Metropolis. So in the meantime, I could be really auditioning a bunch of other different fonts, but because I know what I'm looking for, I'm just going to go straight to Metropolis. I'm going to make that a little bit bigger, so right now it's 100 points, because that's what I used last. I'd also like to increase the space between the M and the I. So that means I have to place my cursor between these two characters, then back into my character palette. I'm going to go to my kerning option, which is second row of your character palette to the left, and with my arrow key, I'm just going to nudge those apart. I want them to have a little bit of space, a little bit of air. So that looks good right about there. Maybe I'll bump it up to 36. And I think that that's good. So as you can see on the original, the text here is very light. It's filled with a light gray. So I'm just selecting my text, coming up into my fill, and just choosing a very, very pale color. So in this case, very pale gray. And in fact, I think I could even go a touch lighter because I just want it to be barely there. And that looks good. So I'm going to take my text, just move it out of the way. Let's plant that over there. Move this into position. And then next, I'm going to go and set my business name, and it's going to sit right over top. So once again, coming back to my text tool, I'm going to set it down below. So I'm just going to click once, and it comes up in Metropolis in that really big size. Come back up into my character, and let's reduce the size quite a bit. So I'm going to bring that down to even less than 60 points, so maybe 48. So here I know that the font is Didot or Dido. So again, into my font selection area, and there's Didot right there. So now I'm going to come back up into my paragraph controls. I'm going to choose center, so align center, and now just retype my text. It's already selected, so I can hit delete and then start Metropolis photo, like so. And just double check to make sure it's correct. Triple click to select the whole thing. And now let's come back up into our control panel. Let's make this a little bit smaller. My selection tool, and then move it into position. So don't want it perfectly centered. I want it kind of to sit a little bit lower, just for interest. But overall, I think that's probably pretty close. So again, the final step is to select both of these text frames, come up to type at the top, create outlines. And now that's artwork. Same thing for the next one. Select the next block. Make sure you're selecting with your selection tool. Come up to type, create outlines. And I could move it around a tiny bit. Just make sure I'm happy with everything. And when I am, select the entire chunk, object, group. And I'm ready to go. So the next logo here is actually really kind of interesting to create. And what you'll see is this illustration has a very photographic look to it. The nice thing is you can take any photograph that you take yourself or you have rights to, and you can bring it into Illustrator and actually create a little digital illustration right from that photograph. To create a digital illustration, we need to have access to our photos. So what you'll see here off to the side is that I have a royalty-free image that I found on the web that is of an old-fashioned camera, and it's a JPEG. So what I do is I take my image, drag it onto my page in Illustrator. So you always make sure you've got a page that's already created in Illustrator, and then just place that image onto the page. So it's going to come in as raster based, but what we're going to do is an image trace and turn it into vector art. So once I have it placed on my page, I want to resize this because it's way too big. So first thing I'm going to do, hold down my shift key, and with my selection tool, just come to one of these corner handles and resize. So the key is holding down the shift key so that you don't distort your image. Next thing I'm going to do is put this into position, and I'll just work in this space that I've got right here. So as it stands, this image is raster based and it is still a JPEG. So I am going to go up to my window at the top, the window menu, and I'm going to scroll down to this palette called Image Trace, and I'm going to select it. That brings up a palette that I can then use to do my tracing. So I could trace it by hand using my pen tool and my pencil tool and my paintbrush and my shapes, but that would be really, really difficult and very time consuming. So because I have the rights to using this image, I can actually just turn it into an illustration and then go from there. So with this selected, my image trace options will become available to me in my palette. And at this point, what I'd like to see is just a black and white logo. So I've got a number of presets across the top. I've also got a preset button here with a drop-down menu. That's the one I'm going to use. So as it stands, it's set to default, but now I'm going to go and choose some of these options I have here. So the sample that I have here is pretty close to the original. In fact, it's just a whole lot of shades of gray, or a high fidelity photo. So I could choose high fidelity photo, I could choose 16 colors or shades of gray. If I went to black and white logo, it's going to reduce it down to just black and white, which is probably going to fill in and not be very legible. So I'm going to choose, I think maybe 16 colors. We'll start with that. So I get a warning that pops up that just basically tells me this is going to take some time to do. And I say, okay, go ahead. So click OK, and then I'd let it do its thing. Get a progress bar. It'll kind of indicate how far along you are, but sometimes it takes a little bit longer than expected. So right now it's doing its thing, it's reading it, and it's determining what colors need to go where. So this is based on 16 colors. Right now I'm just viewing my tracing result. In other words, this is not yet vector art. This is just showing me a preview of what it's going to look like. So if I zoom in on this and I'm not happy with it, I can always come back and try something else. So I could always go back and try 3 colors, and it's going to re-render itself and show me what that preview is going to look like. So we'll just give it a second to do its thing. So that's what it looks like when it's reduced to 3 colors. So I think I preferred the look before, which was 16 colors. So I think we're going to go back to that, because I like the idea of it being more of a realistic, almost photograph. So I think I'm happy with that. Looks good to me. So the last thing that I have to do, the last step here, is to actually create my outlines. So with my image selected, I'm just going to come up to the top here into my control panel. You'll see there's a button here called Expand. I'm going to click on Expand, and basically what that's done now is turned it into vector art. So just by default, everything is automatically grouped together and selected when I click on it. So one of the things I'm going to want to do, if I'm going to go in and modify this further, is just ungroup it. So Object, Ungroup, then Deselect, and then I can come back in and just select different portions of this. So let's say I want to change the color of this. I could select different parts of the artwork and go in and change the color bit by bit. It would take a little bit of time, but I could certainly do it. So I'm going to undo Command Z, because I'm going to leave this the way it is. And I'm quite happy with the look of this. So one thing I want to point out is that it recognized the white background, and it actually created a shape that now has a white fill. So if I want this to be close cropped, I'd actually have to go in and delete that white background. And now you see it's just a close crop. So again, I'm going to just select the whole thing. I'm going to group it so that I don't accidentally pull, a little piece off and distort my artwork, and just leave it as that. So the next thing I'm going to do, add my text. So I've used Jane Austen text and Adobe Garamond. So in this case, click away from it, go in and type in the name of my business, so Jane Doe, then hit return. This is photography. Try to spell that correctly. Photography, like so. And I'm going to select it all. I'm going to make it centered, because you can see I've got it somewhat centered under the original, and get everything into the fonts or selected with the fonts that I want to use. So Adobe Garamond Pro, and I'm going to bump up the size. And in fact, I think what I'm going to do is actually make photography all uppercase. So I'm actually going to retype this, all uppercase, like so. Bring down the size a little bit, and I've got some tracking in there, so some white space between my characters. So I can do that by coming up to Character, going to the Tracking option, and just adding in, it's pretty slow, but adding in a little bit of space, because I like the look of that. And for the Jane Doe portion, select that text. I'm going to come up into my character. I'm going to find my Jane Austen. So down under J, Jane Austen, right there. and then make this quite a bit bigger. Now I can always go in, modify this a little bit more, but generally this is pretty much what I'm looking for. I'm going to fill the Jane Austen portion with a charcoal gray. Let's see how that looks. So deselect. Looking pretty good. I think I'm happy with that. I could go a little bit lighter, but I think I'm going to leave this for now and just get this into position. And let's just slide this over a little bit. Come back to my original illustration. I think I'd like to make it a tiny bit smaller, so I'm going to hold down my Shift key because it's all grouped together. It will resize together and proportionally. And now grab the whole thing and then pull it into position. So just kind of modifying the position slightly. Last step, select with my selection tool, so the black arrow, select the chunk of text, come up to type, go down to create outlines, and now I've just turned it into artwork. Select all pieces together, object, group, done.